There's a term that has gained a lot of popularity online over the last couple of years. Surely you've heard of it. It's called gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is this idea that we who are in part of the community need to protect ourselves from people outside the community who are telling us something that doesn't belong, or who are pretending to be part of us, but they really aren't part of us. It's that type of idea, very much a sort of us against them type mentality. Oftentimes, the reason for it is rooted deeply in historical issues that sometimes the people committing the gatekeeping don't really want you to know about. This is one of the reasons why I keep trying to talk about subjects that we don't talk about so much, such as doing replays with seasons that are extremely untraditional, or things like using video games as a sort of simulation tool, things like that, to see sort of where things fall, who believes in what, and so on and so forth. The place where I've seen the most gatekeeping, though, in the community, to be honest, really comes from the APBA community, especially on the infamous APBA Delphi forum. It's an interesting forum when you know about its history. It really started up in the very early 2000s, back when Delphi forums were actually popular. It was, as I understand it, sort of a refuge for people who were fleeing the then deteriorating APBA journal scene, as well as all of the very, very old bulletin board and Usenet-based discussion groups, many of which have not been archived in any way that I know about. That itself is a problem, because we can't really read the things that people said on those groups and the discussions that took place. All that we have is the APBA journal, and then whatever we can search through using Delphi forum's awful search tools. But we'll talk about that another time. The interesting thing about Delphi forums is that over time it's morphed, and it's taken on very much a pro-company, pro-corporate view, where it's turned into sort of the official form of the APBA game company, which it never was to begin with. Among other things, discussion of games that are clearly related to APBA and that share a very, very common lineage with APBA is forbidden. You have to talk about the company's product and nothing else, even if the other product was made by somebody who actually helped create company products at one point in time. This brings up a lot of problems and a lot of issues, but the biggest problem of all is the historical issue, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So what we're going to do here is we're going back into the archives, we're going back into the APBA journal. We're looking up this issue from January 31st, 1997. Those of you who know about this subject probably already know what I'm going to say, and if you don't, just sit back and wait and we'll take a look. We're going here to page number 19. And in particular, we're looking at this article by Scott Lahotsky. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth about this article that's clear in retrospect. This article is an advertisement. It's an advertisement for a series of auctions that took place mostly under the auspices of the APBA Journal, dealing with the J. Richard Seitz estate directly. I don't know the specifics of the J. Richard Seitz estate. I don't fully understand why every single one of the APBA sets that he had that were original, most of which were in mint condition, had to be auctioned off piecemeal. I don't fully understand why they couldn't be part of the assets of the company. I don't know exactly what was going on behind the scenes. I strongly believe that there may have been some sort of foul play, though I'm certain that people who were deeply involved in the scene at the time will correct me down below in the comments section. All I can say is that it's very strange that the APBA game company today does not have any of the historical pieces that once belonged to the company and its founder, and instead runs out of a very makeshift and not a very run-of-the-mill strip mall down in Georgia, instead of running out of the old APBA building. There's a lot of sort of complicated history going on here that we're not going to cover today, but we will cover over time. The story here is about the National Pastime game, which I've talked about a lot before. If you've read the blog, you know a lot about that. National Pastime was known about starting in the early 1970s. As you'll remember, there was that famous 1976 issue of the APBA Journal that went into much detail about the National Pastime game. To get that one under the nose of J. Richard Seitz and to prevent any sort of lawsuit apparently from happening, Clifford Van Beek's name was changed. And this is a very, very interesting thing to look back at and to think about sort of the politics that were involved. Well, here, almost 22 years after that original article came out, is another article about the history of APBA and about the true relationship between J. Richard Seitz and National Pastime. So when you wind this all the way back, we knew that J. Richard Seitz had played National Pastime at one point in time, but before this article came out, we didn't realize that he had always kept a hold not only of his old cards and boards, but also of his league records. So, interesting thing about this is we go here and read this article probably down around this section right here. J. Richard Seitz was 16 years old in 1931 when he received a baseball game called National Pastime. It claims here that he purchased it. I still maintain that he probably received it as a Christmas present in 1930. That's the thing that makes the most sense to me. Sometime in 1931, Seitz and three of his friends organized a league that they called the American Professional Baseball Association, or APBA. This is where that famed APBA name comes from. It comes from a face-to-face league that J. Richard Seitz played using the old National Pastime game. We know a lot about the game. A lot of the stuff that we've read here, or that you can read here, is actually not fully correct. We know, for example, that Clifford Van Beek went bankrupt himself. It was not his printer that went bankrupt in the 1930s. Interest in Dick Seitz's APBA League in Lancaster had exploded. Well, kind of. I don't believe that. I do believe that Seitz wrote multiple letters to the Major Games Company asking for cards for the 1932 season. Now, it's interesting to note that he's asking for the 32 season. We know that National Pastime, Major Games, went bankrupt early in 1932. So if you're wondering about why the letters were never answered, it's because there was no longer a company called Major Games Company. It had completely gone under because of the debts that Clifford Van Beek had taken on. And so Seitz, over time, decided to create his own cards and improve the game on his own for his league with his friends. In some of the versions of National Pastime that have been sold, some of the reprints, you can get the cards, at least some of the cards that J. Richard Seitz created for himself. Most famously, he created a card for Dizzy Dean, which is not really that useful because none of the pitchers in National Pastime, of course, had any sort of rating. He also created a card for God, which consisted of nothing but ones on every dice roll, so he hit a home run every time he came up. Seitz also created a baseball card for himself. As we might talk about here eventually, once we get all of the materials together, Seitz was a baseball player in the 30s and was of enough renown to be featured in some of the Lancaster newspapers, but unfortunately his career ended up coming to a shrieking halt, which may have been the reason why he focused so much attention on National Pastime. Interesting thing about this is that there had been rumors coming around for quite some time that the APBA baseball game, which many people, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, thought was like some sort of, elixir from the gods. There had been rumors coming out that it was actually a modified version of an older game, right? So there's a little editor's note here. This comes from Eric Naftali, who I know will watch this. Who is talking about when the Weiser and Simonelli article was printed. That's the 1976 article that we're talking about. Seitz ended up giving them the go-ahead because they were worried about destroying their relationship with the game. Of course, as I've noted before, it's really the relationship between APBA and on APBA's side with the APBA Journal that was more important. By this time, the story was partially public, as Eric notes. In the July 24th, 1976 issue of the Sporting News, a column called The Sports Collector by Bill Madden, which must be fascinating to read. One of these days we'll get around to those. This column featured APBA. It was subtitled Outgrowth of Kids Game, and it included the following paragraphs. There is, for one thing, the controversy over how Seitz formulated the game. His detractors have accused him of plagiarizing it from a 1930s game called National Pastime. It's a charge about which Seitz is quite matter of fact. There's never been any secret that APBA grew out of the game we played as kids, Seitz said. But the only real similarity between the two games is principle. There was no pitching per se in the game we played as kids, and the refinements we've done in APBA made it a far more advanced and intricate game than the original. Now, this is partially correct and partially incorrect. The truth of this article, which is actually reprinted in that same issue of the APBA Journal, the truth about this is that National Pastime was a 1930 game that nobody had ever heard of. The only people I know of who became aware of this game before this 1976 Sporting News article were the people who wrote the Extra Innings newsletter, who stumbled across it at some random card show in 1973 up in the Milwaukee area. So nobody had ever heard of National Pastime. If J. Richard Seitz is talking about playing National Pastime in the Sporting News, nobody knows what he's talking about. I think that Seitz was partially aware of this because I know that he spent quite some time looking at other baseball games on the market, and I'm certain that he would have noticed if there was at least some sort of secondary market activity in, say, like the 50s, 60s, or 70s featuring National Pastime. There was none that I'm aware of, because there's so few of those games that exist. And so when Seitz says things like the only real similarity between the two games is principle, he's not entirely correct. As we will see in the future, the boards for the original version of APBA Baseball come directly from the National Pastime boards down to the wording. So much for principle. It is true, however, that there was no pitching in National Pastime and no real outward-facing fielding system, right? So there is a relationship, and there's also not really a relationship. You see, you have to understand this when you're starting to talk about the gatekeeping of APBA and not allowing other variants of National Pastime to be featured alongside APBA. It turns into a very strange story because APBA itself is actually National Pastime. There's an argument that some games such as, I don't know, National Pastime Next Generation Plus or Bill Staffa's NPIII are as different from APBA as APBA was different from National Pastime. That's where you run into the problem, and that's where you run into this strange pro-corporate gatekeeping that honestly, for fans of these games, makes very, very little sense. It can be very off-putting for people, especially potential customers, right? So we're going to go forward with this and talk about what we found here. What was found was a full collection of the original National Pastime game that belonged to J. Richard Seitz. It's included 2 copies of the boards of the game, one that was heavily used and one that was in like new condition. The one that was in very new condition included a Seitz note penciling in an injury that occurred on result number 37 under the bases loaded, which means that Seitz was already starting to sort of come up with his own game. They found the homemade cards that we've already mentioned. Seitz, as we'll get into later on, was very interested in printing for his whole life. And in fact, a lot of the very early APBA material was printed, as I understand, by Seitz on his own home printer, which was actually something in the 1950s. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this, and the thing that appears to have totally disappeared, is there were a number of notebooks featuring the records of the original APBA League. In fact, you can see there were these ribbons given to the World Championship team. There are lists of teams in the various leagues that APBA ran. There were as many as 3 teams per year starting in 1934. And there's a lot of stuff here that's just absolutely fascinating. They typed up complete rules of these leagues. They came up with all sorts of statistics. They followed everything. They printed, homemade, of course, cards for members of the league, and so on and so forth. If you want, the APBA Journal did reprint the original standings of the APBA League. It notes here, when you read the article, that there are some problems because Seitz kind of miscalculated the standings of his team, as it mentions down below. You can see there are only 4 kids playing together, so much for the huge attention paid to the league. And this is sort of what happened in the end, as well as a number of statistics. This is the very first APBA League from 1931. Now, what is not clear from this is exactly when the games were played. The article here assumes that Seitz received the game at some point in time in 1931 and that this wasn't played until the fall. I'm not certain because I don't have the notebooks or the folders that were saved. I'm not sure whatever happened to them. If you know, please let me know. What I would love to see happen with these notebooks is I would like to see this stuff scanned and shared. This is the sort of thing that we really should be focusing on sharing. This is the sort of thing that would actually be productive and helpful for the APBA game community instead of a bunch of fighting over whether some other game fits or doesn't. So this is the true background behind the APBA game company. This is where it all comes from. It's in part a game that J. Richard Seitz thought of himself, and it's in part a game that he created based upon another game that existed that he already had a copy of. This is the advertisement for the auction for the original APBA, or the original National Pastime game. I'm not certain how much this sold for, exactly who got it. I know that there are people who track this sort of thing in the community. One of the worries that I have about this stuff is that these stories will go forgotten. The APBA Journal is a great resource, and fortunately you can still buy the complete archives online for, I think it's still $100 on eBay, and I strongly recommend doing it. But at some point in time, sometime in the future, the lack of new players in the APBA game company will cause a lot of this stuff to become forgotten. The biggest worry that I have is stuff like this ultra rare J. Richard Seitz National Pastime game will end up being somehow discarded or forgotten, or will end up being a footnote in somebody's mind, or just some piece of some huge collection somewhere. I also worry a lot about these notebooks and binders, which contain a lot of very important information about what was the first face-to-face league that I know of in all of baseball simulation. It would be great to have this information, to read it, to be able to catalog it, and to be able to talk about it and analyze it in some form, but we can't because we don't even know who has it. There's a lot of history here that's interesting and should be interesting to anybody with any interest in any sort of baseball simulation, but it's all hidden, and it's hidden somewhere behind, in the dusty closets of collectors who may or may not remember that they actually have what they have today. And then the biggest problem that we have is that there are a lot of people who continue to strongly support the APBA game company through thick and thin, who in many cases do not understand and realize the actual history behind their game. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to tell you that J. Richard Seitz was some sort of awful person or that he was a thief. We're going to talk about this later on. I actually firmly believe that he made a lot of very important changes and modifications that make APBA a completely different game from National Pastime. We know that he spent a lot of time working on this. He spent years modifying and improving his game. He was also a very shrewd businessman. If it wasn't for J. Richard Seitz, this entire community of baseball simulation players and this whole concept of sports simulation would be vastly different. All right, so I don't think that the man was a complete villain or a complete goat. But what I do want to say with this is that the idea of gatekeeping, of sort of keeping all the rest out because they're not the true APBA, is complete folly. And it's an absolute embarrassment, and it really needs to stop. I hope you have a good day. I'll talk with you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.